My name is Lawrence Lessig, and I'm a professor of law at Harvard Law School. So what I perceived in the context of this fight about how to restore the republic or to end the corruption that I think is debilitating the democracy, I thought that the basic problem was that people saw this in a very political way, a left-right way. And it struck me that the issue was not left-right, that there was a fundamental understanding of the problem of this type of corruption that cut across political boundaries. And I was very keen to frame the story in a way that made people see this connection and help bring people along to this fight without them feeling tied to some political perspective. So my objective with the book was to tell a story that would bring people to a place that they could recognize how profound the corruption is that we face, but what kind of corruption that is that we face, and therefore the urgent need to do something about it with the beginnings of thoughts about what that thing is that we should be doing. Well, there are a couple ideas that are built into what I want people to take away from it. Number one is a certain sense of why this is corruption, what makes it corruption. And it's not corruption because it's evidence of criminal behavior by members of Congress. Instead, it's a different kind of corruption. It's a corruption of a system rather than a corruption of individuals. And that system is corrupted because the influences that campaign funding impose upon members and the way that they do their job systematically distorts them from the perspective they would have if what they were concerned about is what the people cared about. So I wanted people to understand this sense of corruption. And then number two, recognize what follows from that, how we might eliminate this sense of corruption. And what kind of political steps would be necessary to bring about this type of reform. Well, I think that a lot of attention has been paid to the president as, in some sense, the focus of where we need to reform. And I can understand why people were inspired to think about the presidency as this locus of corruption when you think about Nixon and the images of that type of presidency. But I actually think the president is not a critically important target of reform because in many ways the design of the office and the modern presidency drives presidents to be thinking about their own conception of the public good, but still a conception of the public good. And instead, we've got to recognize that other half of the legislative process, which is Congress, where conceptions of the public good can too easily be distorted by perceptions of exactly how best to raise campaign funds. So until we reform Congress, it doesn't matter what happens at the president level. And I think if we did reform Congress, then there's a good chance we could get a president and a Congress together that could do things that would restore confidence to the American people. It's not that localities are more subject to corruption. It's just that the influence of money in the life of a congressperson is much more salient, much more significant. You know, the President of the United States spends a significant amount of his time, unfortunately, raising money. But he doesn't spend 30 to 70% of his time raising money. So, you know, there's certainly a sensitivity that the President has about how certain issues are going to make it hard for him to raise money. So the President in this election cycle had to worry about financial reform undermining his ability to raise money from Wall Street, no doubt. But it's not inside of his head all the time, every day, the way it is for a member of Congress. So it's very easy to see the way in which that influence in the context of Congress begins to bend them in ways that are destructive and maybe not as clear in the context of the President. Nobody who crafted our Constitution ever had any conception of campaign finance the way it is today. They didn't even have a conception of campaigning the way it is today. The idea of even running for office, putting yourself out there as a candidate, was anathema to the framers. And so there's nothing from their design that sort of would help us understand what, in fact, we've produced. So I think it's more a product of the way in which competition between the parties for control of Congress has driven both parties to behave in ways which even 30 years ago would have been unrecognizable by many in Congress. It's just this driving competition to wage this perpetual war between the Republicans and the Democrats that has produced a world where neither side can get anything done, even when they're in the majority or supermajority in Congress. Yeah, so, you know, I think that the current dynamic is driven by the extraordinary competition that exists between Democrats and Republicans for control of Congress. And that competition is relatively recent in origin. For much of the history of the 20th century, Congress was institutionally democratic. It wasn't really possible to imagine the Republicans taking control for a sustained period of time of both the Senate and the House. But as the Democrats became more active supporting civil rights legislation, the demographics of the parties began to change. And when Ronald Reagan capitalized on a revived conservative movement, he really built a political party that was increasingly competitive with the Democrats. And so when Newt Gingrich oversaw the final victory of the Republicans taking control of the House for the first time in 40 years, it woke the Democratic Party up to the fact that they were not the presumptive majority party anymore. They were going to have to work for that. Now, you know, in most of our life, we think competition is great, and competition is typically great. But sometimes competition can drive an institution to behave in ways which is really destructive. So that's what happened with financial services, and that's what happened with Congress. They've become so competitive and therefore need to raise so much money to win their elections that the job of being a congressman has shifted from the job of figuring out what's in the public interest or what's in the interest of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to what's the way to raise the most money to get your party back in power. And that change, beginning with Gingrich and really taking off in the first part of this century, has radically changed the character of Congress. And I think until we address that fundamental change, we're not going to have a hope to fixing Congress. Yeah, so the problem isn't competition on its own. The problem is competition that gets waged through a fight about raising money. So if the competition were a competition about getting the most votes, that would be healthy. You know, it would be like both parties are fighting hard to attract the right kind of voter to get to the majority position. And if we had competitive districts and not an obsessive focus on raising money, that might be productive and conducive to a more responsive democracy. But given the way we fund elections, the way competition manifests itself is an ever more intense fight to raise money from the tiniest slice of the top 1% of America. So as members become more obsessed with raising money, they listen more carefully to the concerns of those fraction of the top 1% who are going to fund campaigns. So, you know, right now, in 2010, 0.26% of Americans gave more than $200 in a congressional campaign. 0.05% of Americans gave the maximum amount to any congressional candidate. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, gave more than $10,000 in the election cycle. So that's a tiny fraction of the top 1% that has an enormous influence inside the political system because the political system depends upon them to fund their campaigns. Now, if we had a different way of funding campaigns, it wouldn't be that kind of dynamic. They'd depend upon someone, but it wouldn't be this tiny slice of the top 1%. And that's the critical difference, I think, about a healthy competitive system and an unhealthy competitive system. So if we had the right way to fund campaigns, the kind of corruption that I'm talking about would disappear. It's not to say we'd have utopia. It's not to say we'd have Congress that would react to what the people want. It's not to say that there wouldn't be special interests that have more power than the general interest. It's just to say that the particular pathology of a Congress obsessed on its funders, obsessed with its funders, as opposed to obsessed with what the people want, would have disappeared. And we can, then return to the fight about how to make democracy responsive and all the other democratic reforms we need in order to make it responsive. But it takes that first step before we're going to have this change.